Welcome to this special edition of the Sky News Daily podcast, where we're taking a look at some of the stories which define 2022 and how they might shape our lives in the future. Over 5 special episodes, we'll cover the economy, the royal family, the war in Ukraine and climate change. But on this episode, we are looking at the tumultuous year in politics. And if you are watching, you might just be able to tell that we are here in our Westminster studio, and joining us, our political editor, Beth Rigby. Beth, lovely to see you. And first things first, that is a snazzy top.
Yes, Neil, I have put on my Christmas jumper, especially for this podcast edition. It's given me quite a lot of joy. I hope it gives our viewers joy too, but I don't mind if you also think it's a bit over the top. But it's my Christmas jumper and it's a Christmas podcast.
I think that the listeners on the podcast don't know what a favour they have done by just listening. Anyway, Beth, let us reflect on 2022. And again, I am not someone who is as plumbed into the Westminster machinery as you are, but I have never known a year in politics like it. You'd agree?
I would agree. And actually, you've just put up on the screen, I know the podcasters can't see that, but there's the 3 prime ministers. Now, I've been political editor at Sky News since May 2019. And when I took the job, I thought, if I'm lucky, I might see the handover of power once or twice. I didn't expect to see 3 prime ministers through the door at number 10 in 4 months. And I actually checked with Adam Bolton, the great Adam Bolton, who was Polled here for 25 years. I said, Adam, how many new prime ministers did you see go through the door? And he said 4 in 25 years. So it gives you a perspective about the turmoil. And actually, the Collins Dictionary gave the word of 2022, their word of 2022 was permacrisis. And that basically means the feeling of living through a period of war, inflation and political turmoil. And that does encapsulate, doesn't it, the year of 2022. But from my part, I mean, Ed did the economy, I mean, I did the political turmoil, and it was tumultuous and it was a bit bonkers.
I was reflecting for a while on where we should start our discussion, but of course it has to be with Boris Johnson and his demise. But actually, we need to rewind, I think, to the tail end of 2021 when that video emerged of the then comms director at number 10, Allegra Stratton, essentially confessing to the fact that a party had happened or something similar. Fast forward into January of that year, and Boris Johnson, at the very least, had to admit that he had attended events. He didn't believe there were parties. That was the beginning of the end, I think.
It was the beginning of the end. And actually, to put that into context, Neil, this was the guy, and it was only this week on December the 12th, it was, that marked the 3rd anniversary of that landslide electoral victory. Do you remember?
Yeah,
80-seat majority, 2019, December 2019, the biggest Conservative majority since the days of Margaret Thatcher. That guy was meant to be in for certainly a term in office, if not 2. And as you said, it began to all unravel from January onwards. And really from January onwards, we were in political crisis, and it waxed and waned through the first half of the year. But it was the beginning of the end. And it wasn't necessarily the story of Partygate in itself. It was the handling of it by Johnson and his team, which was start with denial, then begin to admit things but don't accept culpability. And
ambushed by cake.
Ambushed by cake. No one told me. I remember that interview I did with the PM. He said, no one told me it wasn't OK. And it went on and on and on. And really, it was a fascinating time, Neil, because if 2021 had been the year of COVID, so 2020 and 2021, they win a massive majority. We're then plunged into the COVID crisis from Jan 2020 onwards. And then 2022 was almost the year where Johnson could have started what he wanted to do in that premiership because everything had been stalled by COVID. And yet what happened in practice was a government in political turmoil because of Partygate, the crisis, his handling of the crisis. And what we saw the first 6 months of that year was really the mistakes he made, the questions about his character, and in the end, the parliamentary party and members of his government losing faith in him and his ability to lead, and also the public. I mean, the polling was terrible.
Yeah, I mean, they were firefighting. They were firefighting from January the 1st, but by my reckoning, that was certainly his stated position. But there was a period where everyone here in Westminster was waiting for, remember this name, the Sue Gray report, to find out what was going on inside Downing Street. Now, ultimately, that didn't amount to a huge amount that we didn't know already. Instead, it was a man called Chris Pincher that really started the dominoes toppling at the end.
So the thing about Chris Pincher, and this was the deputy chief whip, there were issues about he had sexually harassed people. I should say these are claims that he refutes, just to be clear. But that was really, Neil, the straw that broke the camel's back, because it's often something that happens that's not core to the actual sort of turmoil, but it signals something about the leadership that really breaks the dam.
Did we ever get to the heart of whether or not Boris Johnson knew?
So the issue was that there had been claims made about Chris Pincher when he'd worked in the Foreign Office with Boris Johnson as Foreign Secretary. And Boris Johnson said, I had never been made aware of any of these issues around Chris Pincher. And it was then Simon MacDonald, who was the former permanent secretary, the chief civil servant at the Foreign Office, who then said, I know this not to be true because I personally told the Prime Minister, who was then Foreign Secretary. And that happened overnight, and I remember it. I've interviewed Simon MacDonald about that since. I said, why did you do it? Because you must have known your role, what your role would be in the downfall. And his view was, I didn't really understand the enormity of what would come to pass in terms of his role in Boris Johnson's demise. But he just said, I knew that to be an untruth and someone had to call it out. What happened after that, Neil, was MacDonald put out a letter saying that is not true, and then became those cascade of resignations. And that was the beginning of the end. And actually, Boris Johnson, I think it was 48 hours later, was on the steps of Downing Street handing in his resignation. The thing about a Prime Minister is that they are all powerful, but their power really is based on the pleasure, if you like, of their backbenchers willing to support them. And once that, and their government, and once that support is withdrawn, a Prime Minister is suddenly very weak. And he was forced out of Downing Street. He made it very clear he didn't want to go. You remember he said, when the herd moves, it moves, and it stampeded him.
Well, you say he was out of Downing Street. I mean, he came outside, said he was going to step down at some point, then went back in and had another month doing the job, didn't he? Talk to me a little bit about that time in the Conservative Party, because, of course, we went through the parliamentary process. We had the candidates, narrowed down to Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. Then it went out to the membership, and it was brutal, wasn't it?
Brutal. Look, the thing about all of it, from the fall of Johnson to the rise of Truss, to the fall of Truss, to now the bumping along, should I put it, of Sunak, is throughout of all of this, the characteristic has been the infighting in the Conservative Party. Yeah. And you need to look at the kind of what happened with the various leaders through that lens. So there was a move that Boris Johnson had to go, he went. Then what happened with Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak? Well, there were loads of runners and riders in that race. Boris Johnson, although he never publicly came out to support Liz Truss, privately made it very clear that he was backing Liz Truss. That precipitated some of his key allies, I'm thinking Nadine Dorries and Jacob Rees-Mogg, then key members in the cabinet, to publicly endorse Truss. Now, the challenge for Truss was, could she get to the membership? Could she make it through to the final two? Rishi Sunak was the favourite with MPs. He got past the 100 mark. And then it was a battle between Mordaunt and Truss, and Truss just about won out. And actually, the vote was so tight, Neil, I think it was 4 or 5 in it. So said 8 votes in it, I think. So had 4 or 5 MPs switch sides. It's like sliding doors. There would have been a completely different process. The problem Rishi Sunak had, and some of those close to him sort of admitted this to me after the race, was there were about 30% of the party members that were die-hard Boris Johnson backers. So once Boris Johnson had made it clear that Rishi Sunak was the traitor, that Rishi Sunak had wielded the sword, that he was supporting Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak went through that very bruising leadership race the whole summer fighting, knowing that he could not win.
Yeah. Well, let's then talk and devote a bit of time to the Liz Truss premiership. And given that she was in power for 44 days, we can probably wrap it up in a couple of minutes, I would have thought.
I don't know, though, because the ramifications of those 44 days were quite profound, weren't they, on the economy?
Totally. But, I mean, it strikes me that mini budget, which was not a mini budget at all, was... Again, was the beginning of the end. Why did she, and we should not forget, of course, Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng, why did they get it so wrong? And why are they still, to this day, to an extent, maintaining that the problems which emerged immediately after that mini budget were problems that every other country were experiencing at the same time?
I mean, look, Liz Truss hasn't spoken publicly at all about what happened yet. Kwasi Kwarteng, her Chancellor, has a bit, and he has admitted that they didn't, bring people with them. They went too far. They went too fast. I mean, she sort of said a little bit of that when she was still Prime Minister, when she reversed that budget. But what was going on? It's a good question, Neil. And, Liz Truss had a view, and she still holds this view about the sort of intellectual underpinning of what she did, that financial fiscal orthodoxy was not going to turbocharge the economy in a way she wanted. So she had a deregulatory, tax-cutting, small state approach to the economy that she thought you took pain now, but you would turbocharge growth, and then over time she would be proven right, yeah? And she assembled a cabinet around her of believers that would not challenge her on this quite radical economic plan. What was the mistake? Well, Rishi Sunak would have argued the mistake was trying to put that plan in place at this point.
Because he warned about it. He warned about these outcomes, every single one of them.
I remember Raab saying, your economic policies are an electoral suicide note for the Conservative Party. Rishi Sunak called them fantasy economics. But where did they go wrong in the mini budget? I remember sitting in the studio and Ed Conway and I were watching it unfold. And she had made promises about cutting corporation tax, cutting income tax. There were huge tax cuts that Liz Truss had signalled, but then she went even further. And that was, in a way, what spooked the market, because she was already at the limits, maybe, of what the markets would tolerate, and then she doubled down on that. And then it was what I can't remember the figure now, 45 billion of tax cuts, I think it was, which were unfunded. And then that precipitated, you remember, the steepest fall, pound fell to a record low, Bank of England's 65 billion bond buy-in programme in order to prop up pension funds, mortgages being withdrawn, over 1,000 mortgages withdrawn from the markets as interest rates, which we knew were going up, went up more quickly than anticipated, and a lot of short-term pain and longer-term pain for the public.
We're going to have to take a break in just a second, but of course, all of this increased the pressure within the party on her till ultimately it became impossible for her to cling on. But yet again, it was the members that got rid of her and the members that put in Rishi Sunak. And that has not sat well, has it, with the grassroots of the party?
That's right. So, look, it was clear after the mini-budget and when Liz Truss went to party conference and she reversed her decision on the cutting the 45 pence tax rate, the Express and the Mail, her two big backing newspapers, had the wrong headlines on the Monday morning because they literally took the decision in the wee hours of Sunday night, right? At that point, you're like, this is it, she's done. Yeah. It's just a question of when is she done. Her credibility was shot and then it unravelled very quickly from that. But as you said, what happened next was that Boris Johnson was really seriously considering a run to return. He'd felt he'd been wronged by being kicked out.
Yep.
There were 100 MPs that wanted to back him, but there were conversations that were had over that weekend when the deadline was the Monday afterwards, where he was told in no uncertain terms, there is a core of the party that will back you, but there are more that won't. You won't be able to command a government. You need 160 MPs to form a government. He couldn't do it. And then there was a sort of a view within the party. Some people wanted a short runoff between Penny Mordaunt and Rishi Sunak. And she nearly got to the number. She got to 93, 94. You needed 100. But then some of her supporters switched. And the reason was there's a decision in the party, like, we don't want to put this to members again.
Yep.
We want it done. But you are right, there therefore is a legitimacy issue with Rishi Sunak because he was picked by MPs, not with grassroots. And some of those people that backed Boris, and you saw it this weekend with Priti Patel leading a grassroots campaign, feel that the members have been cut out of the decision-making process, and it's a very unhappy party.
We will delve into that a little bit in just a moment. But after the break, we will, of course, be talking a lot more about Rishi Sunak, Labour's future, and ask what 2023 may bring for British politics. Who knows? And welcome back to this special edition of the Sky News Daily podcast. We are here in Westminster with our political editor, Beth Rigby. And just before we went into the break, Beth, we were talking about the problems that Rishi Sunak may well have.
Yeah.
But it kind of feels now that things have slightly settled down.
They have, yeah.
You know, in terms of the fact we have Rishi Sunak leading the Conservative Party as Prime Minister, and we don't feel like he is going anywhere. The knives might be out for him, but they're not getting plunged into his back at the moment. And in Keir Starmer, again, the Labour Party feels a bit more settled. Yeah. We are starting to see the dividing lines on which the next election is going to be fought.
Yeah, I think also what's happened is we've moved away, if you like, from personality politics. Mm-hmm. More populist, instinctive politicians.
Are you suggesting that those two men don't have a personality?
I couldn't possibly say that, Neil. They actually have quite a lot of personality, but when they get in front of a camera, both of them are much more controlled, actually. They're much more personable and relaxed off camera, both of them, whereas Boris Johnson had a performative side to him, like that he was in performance mode, whether on or off camera. But we've definitely gone back towards away from personality politics, more to sort of issues of policy. I think the question for Rishi Sunak and the Conservative Party is whether you loved or loathed Boris Johnson, he put the Conservative Party within touching distance of Labour. Even once the Partygate had begun to die down, the polls were beginning to narrow again. Now, with Rishi Sunak, they're not really. Labour is still well ahead. There's some questions about whether or not if the Conservatives do really badly in the May elections next year, will there be a momentum from some in the party to try and get Boris Johnson back?
Seriously, at the point, I mean, genuinely, Boris Johnson, I mean, because he came so close to standing again, of course, as you mentioned just before.
I don't think he's given up ambition.
Really?
Yeah, and I mean, look, let's see what happens with the Privileges Committee. I mean, part of what happens to him is determined by that. But if we go back to who's in at the moment, Rishi Sunak, I would say, is sort of performing a bit more as a technocrat at the moment. You know, he's like a chief operating officer. It's like, I will run your government and I will try and have good governance and I'm just going to try and get things done. Of course, he's stymied somewhat by the fact that the country is in crisis at the moment, and it's not just about the cost of living. It's about strikes, it's about inflation, it's about not being able to get a GP appointment, it's about immigration, it's about small boats. There's so many big policy issues and difficulties that he as Prime Minister has to deal with. And meanwhile, Sir Keir Starmer is presenting as the Prime Minister in waiting and a government in waiting. And I thought what was very interesting was earlier this month, Keir Starmer did a big launch on a huge devolution project commission, actually, that Gordon Brown had done. It's 155 pages. It was all about taking power from Westminster and putting it back into local communities, abolishing the House of Lords, restricting second jobs for MPs. It was kind of lofty but quite abstract stuff when people are worrying day to day about how are they going to pay the bills and can they get the kids what they want for Christmas, right? I wrote a story about this and it was one of the most read stories on the website and I was genuinely surprised. I thought, I'm interested in that, but I'm a political geek. Like, I love this stuff. This is what I live for. You know, but actually the fact that a lot of people clicked onto that story and they read it, what does it tell me? People are taking another look at Labour. The challenge for Labour over the next 2 years, over the next year, is that guy, Keir Starmer, he might have political momentum, he might be 20 plus points ahead in the polls, but in terms of the electoral maths of how an election in this country works, it's still really hard to see, Neil. How does he win an outright majority?
Without Scotland.
The route, you know this so well. You know, you covered elections for Sky. The route through to number 10 for the Labour Party goes through Scotland. And back in 2005, when they won a 60-seat majority, 41 of the seats were in Scotland. How many have they got now? One.
Yeah.
Nicola Sturgeon is dominant in Scotland. And that's the challenge, really, I think, for Keir Starmer as well. It's like he has the political momentum, he has the lead in the polls. In the end, how do they translate it into an outright majority? And the Conservative Party will come at them with the same messaging that was in the 2015 election, which is vote for Labour, get Nicola Sturgeon.
In 2023, are things going to calm down enough that I might actually be able to get a sit down and perhaps a weekend of peace to myself? Because to be fair, you know, as we've had this discussion and reflecting on the events of the past 12 months. There are bits that I've forgotten. There are bits that I thought happened 3 years ago. I think everyone could do with a breather, and the country could do with getting sorted out.
Look, the past 12 months have been insane, but you have to set the political crisis in the context of external global events, right, that had an impact domestically. First it was COVID, then it was war in Ukraine. And what you can't predict is what might happen beyond domestic politics that somehow define the era that we are living in. I do think, though, that the fall of Johnson and Truss, because they were kind of politicians cut from the same cloth, there is definitely a sort of different approach to government, maybe more a conventional approach. But you can't discount external events. And also, when you think about it, yes, inflation will fall back. Hopefully at the end of next year, that's the prediction.
Fingers crossed.
But we still have strike action coming up. There's still huge questions about the NHS. We have got tax rises coming up. Public spending is going to be subdued. We've got the May local elections. So I do think it's going to be... And what is going to happen in the war with the war in Ukraine? Is it going to escalate? Will it de-escalate? Much will be defined by what Putin decides to do over the next 12 months. So I do think, from my perspective, because I also quite want to sit down on a cup of tea, so from my perspective, I don't think we're going to have the political chaos that we had, but you can't discount anything in this game anymore. And let's see what happens in those May local elections as well.
Well, we will soon see. Beth, it's a pleasure, as always.
I've enjoyed it.
Thank you for being with us. And if you scan the QR code that will be appearing on your screen right about now, you can subscribe to the Daily Podcast, listen back to the chat with Beth, plus all of our other reviews of 2022. So, thanks very much for joining us. We'll see you next time.